As your Vice Speaker, one of my distinct privileges is being able to invite and plan the annual Moreton Lecture. It's a feature each year of the ACR's annual meeting. And before I introduce our honored speaker, I'd like to spend a few minutes and share some brief background about Robert D. Moreton, for whom this lecture is named. Just working on some AV glitches here, sorry. Dr. Robert Moreton, he was born in Mississippi in 1913. He attended Millsaps College in Jackson, Mississippi, and then went on to study medicine at the University of Tennessee, where he earned his MD in 1938. He subsequently pursued his training in radiology at the Mayo Clinic through 1941. After training, Dr. Moreton joined the Scott and White Clinic in Temple, Texas, where he remained until 1950. While in Temple, he met Alma, born in Eastland, Texas, and a Juilliard graduate violinist who he married in 1945. He later joined the Bond Radiology Group in Fort Worth, where he practiced until 1965. During that time, he served on the clinical faculty at the Southwestern Medical School. In 1965, he then joined the staff of the MD Anderson Medical Center, where he continued to practice until 1984. Dr. Moreton made significant contributions to GI radiology. He was active in a variety of statewide health issues in Texas and was appointed by six different governors to several important voluntary positions. Most notably, he served for 24 years on the Texas Board of Health, and in 1988, its then new building in Austin was named in his honor. Among his many other roles, he served for many years as a board member of the John S. Dunn Research Foundation, a large philanthropic group which has endowed this lecture in his and his wife's name. Dr. Moreton was active in a variety of different roles in the Texas Radiological Society, serving as its president in 1952. And for that outstanding service, he was awarded the TRS Gold Medal in 1974. His recognition, however, was national. The RSNA awarded him its gold medal in 1972, and the ACR awarded him ours in 1992. In 1992, Dr. Moreton passed away at the age of 79. After his death, the John S. Dunn Research Foundation made a generous donation to the ACR to underwrite this event, our annual Robert D. and Alma Moreton Lecture. For this year's Moreton Lecture, I'm delighted to have Dr. Anupam Babu Jena with us today. Dr. Jena is the Ruth L. Newhouse Associate Professor of Healthcare Policy at Harvard Medical School and a physician in the Department of Medicine at the Massachusetts General Hospital. He also serves as Faculty Research Fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. As both an economist and a physician, Dr. Jena's research involves several areas of health economics and policy, including the economics of physician behavior and the physician workforce, healthcare productivity, medical malpractice, and the economics of medical innovation. His work has been published in some of the leading journals of both medicine and economics and has been featured in prestigious news outlets rather frequently, such as the New York Times and the Washington Post. Many of us, and certainly me, know him well through Twitter, which is my primary way of interacting with Babu, where he is well known for his tweets. You can follow him today, which are often humorous and I would argue provocative, and not uncommonly challenge conventional wisdom and dogma, which is part of why we've invited him here today. Dr. Jena graduated Phi Beta Kappa from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with majors in both biology and economics. He received both his MD and his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. He completed his residency in internal medicine at the Massachusetts General Hospital. In 2007, he was awarded the Eugene Garfield Award by Research America for his work demonstrating the economic value of medical innovation in HIV and AIDS. In 2013, he received the NIH Director's Early Independence Award to fund research on the physician determinants of healthcare spending, quality, and patient outcomes. In 2015, he was awarded the International Society of Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes. I was able to do that without a pause. And Outcomes Research New Investigator Award. More recently, Dr. Jena served as a member of the Institute of Medicine Committee on Diagnostic Errors in Healthcare. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Babu Jena to the stage. And could his mini audience come on up on stage, please?
So right now we have an audience of 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Thank you for having me. So as Rich said, I have a PhD in economics, and I practice about 6 weeks out of the year at Mass General Medicine on the General Medicine Service. I want to walk you through the types of work that I do, the way I think about problems in healthcare. Some of the things I'm going to talk about you might have heard about before, others hopefully not. Feel free to share this on social media. If there's things that I haven't published yet, I'll try to bring those up so that you don't share those, but I recognize this is a big audience, so I'm playing with fire in that respect. But what I wanted to do was do an exercise and not have this be a traditional lecture, and make this about thinking on the spot and thinking creatively and thinking about topics that you might have some inherent understanding about, but you just haven't thought about in the way that we'll do today. And I'd like to get some audience participation. I recognize this is a big audience, but I have about 5 or 6 examples that I'll go through, and we'll do this together. And I'm going to ask all of you to introduce yourselves as well. And then as you start to see how the game unfolds, I'll ask you to just come up to the podiums, and I'll call on you. If you have an idea, just say it. We'll try to be quick, and I'll move from example to example. And the idea here is not to go into a lot of detail into any given thing, but to get a flavor of how I think, which I think is a little bit different. But I recognize that the title Thinking Differently does sound a little bit obnoxious, and so the alternative was going to be, let's see, does this? Natural experiments in healthcare. Does that sound that interesting? It doesn't sound interesting at all. Oh, okay. Oh, perfect. By the way, I have definitely given talks where I had the wrong slides, and so I'm prepared to give this without slides if we need to. So just let me start by giving you some examples of work, and then, but first, let me give examples of work, then I'll turn it over to you all to introduce yourselves, and then we'll start with this little exercise. Does that sound okay? Sounds good? Okay, all right. So, does the stress of politics kill? So if you look at photos of Obama or Clinton over their tenure in office, they grade considerably. And it's often asked, well, does being president lead to premature aging, rapid acceleration of aging? It's a reasonable question, right? Being in office is extraordinarily stressful. You make a lot of decisions. But how do you study that? Because if you look at the data, presidents, for example, live a lot longer than the general population. Not surprising, right? They have better access to medical care, they're wealthier, they're more educated, not a surprise. So how would you study this in a way that is kind of more aligned with trying to get a causal effect of being a world leader? So what we did was we looked at world leaders compared to runners-up in the election. And the idea is that these two groups of people are otherwise pretty similar, but one group happened to win the election and the other one didn't. And what you find is that world leaders, on average, if you look at presidents, chancellors, prime ministers, they live about 3 fewer years than the runners-up in the election. So I recognize it has some implications for our current state of affairs, but I'm not going to comment on any politics. That's your job. All right. How do patient outcomes differ between male and female internists? So this was a study we published about a year ago, and what we did is we looked at patients who are treated in the hospital by essentially a hospitalist. Now, why do we look at hospitalists? Well, we looked at hospitalists because one is they account for over 60% of all general medicine hospitalizations today. But the second thing is that when you go to the hospital and you are treated by a hospitalist, you don't choose that doctor. That doctor is effectively random to you. Just like when you go to the emergency department, the doctor that you see there is effectively random. And you could actually argue the same thing is true about radiologists within a large center who might be interpreting your study. Unless it's a very specialized study, the imaging that a given radiologist might review might be pretty random compared to others in that large practice. And what we found was the following. Actually, let me do a mini poll here, so raise your hands. If you go to the hospital as a patient with pneumonia or heart failure, a general medicine condition, do you think your 30-day mortality is higher, lower, or the same if you were treated by a male physician? So let's say lower if you're treated by a male physician. Okay, you guys are sharp. Otherwise, I was going to move on with marital counseling after this, but all right, okay, good. All right, the same. Lower?
Yeah. Oh, perfect. What?
Higher.
Higher.
Higher, yeah. So it turns out, oddly enough, that if you go to the hospital and your inpatient medicine physician, general medicine physician, is a female, your 30-day mortality rate is between 5 and 10% lower. Now, why that is, I'm happy to speculate after this, but it raises questions, particularly because there's a lot of interest in the last several years about gender inequities in medicine, both in compensation, in promotion, both in academic medicine, and also just in the healthcare sector overall. And so this, I think, was an important finding, and my best analysis would be that if you look outside of healthcare, let's say in finance, there's good evidence that men and women differ in terms of how they make decisions in finance. And so the same things might apply here as well. The last example of some work that we did recently, actually, this was published in the British Medical Journal a couple weeks ago, is do physician preferences, political preferences, influence care? So it's obviously true that healthcare is very politically polarized. That's not a surprise to anybody. About a year ago, there was a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences which suggested that if your physician is a Republican, that you might have different healthcare outcomes or certainly practices applied to as a patient than if your doctor is Democrat. And that study got a lot of attention, and they looked at politically polarized healthcare topics such as contraceptive counseling, firearm storage practices, things like that. And the problem is that's a survey, so we don't really know how it is that doctors who are Republican or Democrat might actually behave in the real world. And so what we did is we looked at data from Medicare. So we had data on millions of Americans. We linked that information to who was the primary inpatient physician that was responsible for that care. We then linked that information to political contribution data. So this information is actually publicly available. And so what we could see is, do we see differences between doctors who are Democrat and Republican, at least in the inpatient setting, for patients who are at the end of life, people who either die in the hospital or at high predicted risk of dying within a short-term period after hospitalization? And what we find is there's absolutely no difference. So there's no difference in referral to hospice, there's no difference in referral to the ICU, there's no difference in placement of feeding tubes, initiation of dialysis, whatever it is. So at least in this kind of important topic, I think, end-of-life care, which can be politically charged, we find no evidence that political preferences influence care. So that is, I think, a reassuring message for the practice of medicine. And so that's like the pitch. This is the kind of work that I do. You can see it's all over the place. It doesn't have a unified theme insofar as it relates to economics. So it's kind of Freakonomics-like in some respect. But it's about using big data, thinking about causality, trying to understand what causes what, and using data and methods from economics to kind of think through these issues. And all of these are what we call natural experiments. In medicine, we have randomized controlled trials. We can randomize patients to one drug or device versus the other. But in economics, it's difficult to come by those kinds of experiments. And so what we sometimes do is rely on natural experiments. These are situations where individuals, in this case patients or doctors, might find themselves in a situation they didn't plan to be in, but nonetheless can tell us something about how the world works, how doctors think, how patients behave. So that's what I want to talk about today. And so what I'll do now is ask each of you to say your name, where you're from, and then we'll get started on this process together. Does that sound good? All right, let's start here.
Hi, I'm Patricia Baltazar. I'm from Emory University, and I'm a second-year resident.
Thank you, Patricia.
Hi, I'm Amy Patel, and I'm a breast radiologist at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston.
Hi, I'm Sonia Gupta. I'm an abdominal imager at Temple Hospital in Philadelphia.
Syed Zaidi, interventional radiologist with Radiology Partners.
Amy Kotsanis, neuroradiologist at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota.
Neil Lal, I'm a pediatric neuroradiologist at Oxford Clinic in New Orleans.
Daniel Ortiz, fourth-year resident at Eastern Virginia Medical School, soon to be in San Diego.
Okay, Neil, first question to you, what's your favorite ice cream?
Chocolate.
Chocolate, okay. So this is an icebreaker. Do you have any idea what we're going to do today? You have no idea, is that correct? Good. You couldn't have an idea because I just came up with it last night. No, I'm just, that's not true. It's okay, no, it's not true. All right, so this will be fun. Don't be nervous. At the end, I'll pay it forward to you in another way. So I'm going to open up to you, and then I'm going to start to ask you to come up to the speakers, if you don't mind. So what is this a photo of?
Looks like a marathon.
It's a marathon.
Yeah.
It's a marathon. We all agree it's a marathon?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So tell me some ideas. What's the first idea, research or otherwise, that comes to you when you look at this photo? And by the way, it doesn't even have to do with the Boston Marathon. You could tell me, I want to understand what is the effect of emotional well-being of watching Harry Potter marathons on TV. Just has to have the word marathon in there. And feel free to start trickling up to the podium.
You could talk about health outcomes of marathoners.
Good, so you could look at this photo and say, what are the health outcomes of people that run marathons? So do you think that people who run marathons are going to have better or worse long-term health outcomes?
I think actually worse.
Think worse. Why worse?
Cardiovascular stress, bad knees, etc.
Yeah, so it turns out that running a marathon does confer some degree of ischemia and infarction to the heart. So if you measure troponin levels in runners of marathons, you'll find that they're elevated. They might even mimic what you would observe in a heart attack. So imagine if you followed marathon runners out 20 or 30 years, could it be the case that they have higher rates of arrhythmias because they have little scar tissue that forms from this kind of repeated injury of doing what God probably didn't intend us to do, to run 26. Have any of you run marathons, by the way? Okay, God intended you to run a marathon. All right, okay. Okay. Have any of you thought about running a marathon?
No.
Have anybody thought, why would I run a marathon?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right, the whole audience was in. All right. So how would you study this, though? So I'll give you a freebie. I bet if you look at marathon runners today, they're going to be a lot healthier, right? I mean, that's what allows them to run a marathon. So how would you study what is the causal effect of running a marathon on long-term health? How would you do that? I'll tell you what the answer will not be. So you can't just look at people 20 years from now and say, did you used to run marathons versus not? Because you might actually find that the people who used to run marathons have better health outcomes. That's what allowed them to run marathons. So this is a problem that economists will think of as being a selection bias problem. You can't say that marathons are causing some behavior because people are not really randomized to marathons like patients may be randomized to a drug in a clinical trial. So how might you do that?
You would have to select a patient population where you study prospectively that they agree to not run marathons, and versus a population that does run marathons over a significant period of time, and compare the outcomes, but in other ways their lives are fairly similar.
Yeah, so in other ways their lives are similar. So can any of you think of a situation where someone wanted to run a marathon? They trained for a marathon, let's say, but didn't run a marathon, just for random reasons. Any ideas come to mind of something that might generate that sort of what I call natural experiment? I told you they were not prepped on this, so if you hear silence, that's why. Any ideas?
Well, if they're doing the treadmill exercises every day so that they're kind of, prepping for it, but they're just not out there running a marathon on the street.
Good.
But they're doing that level of exercise.
So they're doing that level of exercise, but something happens which prevents someone from running a marathon. So it could be that they sprain their ankle. It's like a random injury. You're walking, you sprain your ankle. Hard to come on data. Anybody from New York? Where's the New York chapter here? Okay. So New York had a marathon canceled several years ago. Is that correct? Raise your hand if that was correct. Yeah. So it was canceled because of bad weather. So imagine you had a list of all of the people who were supposed to run the New York Marathon, and you followed them out 30 years ago. Now, obviously, we're not going to think about this study 30 years from now, but you had a list of such people. You compared them to people who ran the year before, and then looked at 30-year rates of arrhythmias. That would be some exogenous event, some random event that prevented some people from running a marathon. So that's one way you might start to look at what is the long-term impact. Or some marathons have thresholds for participation. So you have to be below 5 hours to qualify. But what about the people who are 5 hours and 5 minutes? Those people should be very similar to the people who run it in 4 hours and 55 minutes. But there's this arbitrary threshold which induces some group of people to be running the marathon and other groups not. That type of strategy is actually pervasive in medicine. We have blood pressure thresholds, cholesterol thresholds. I'm sure there's things in radiology where we have number of lesions or tumor size which induce patients to be in different sort of categories, and that induces this sort of randomization into two passive care. So that is not the idea that I actually had in mind. So that was time for all of you to now think. You're looking at this photo, you see a lot of people. Now, imagine that you're thinking about the side streets now, like 2 or 3 streets over. What would those streets look like to you, if you had to guess?
Empty,
Empty. Why would those streets be empty?
because everybody's watching the marathon.
Yeah, so everybody's watching the marathon. Why else? Why else might roads that are nearby the marathon be empty?
Blocked off.
Blocked off. Okay, all right. So, what is the implication of having roads blocked off?
Higher traffic, different traffic patterns may have more accidents and things like that.
Okay, so different traffic patterns. Now, I want you to take that idea and think about it in the context of health. What is the implication of having roads blocked off?
Presumably, people may be missing deadlines or meetings, so they might be driving more erratically or having difficulty getting to their destination.
So missing meetings, that might be positive for health.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Yeah. What else?
The people who are attending the marathon can't get out.
So the people who can't attend, it's hard for them to get out. What about people, let's say Miss Thomas, who's 80 years old, who lives a couple of streets down? Suppose she has chest pain.
Ambulance can't get to her.
Maybe it's difficult for the ambulance to get to her, or maybe if her husband is going to drive her to the hospital, it would be more difficult for them to get to the hospital. Does that sound reasonable? So I'll tell you a story. My wife is a radiologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital. She does MSK imaging. And a few years ago, she asked me to come and watch her in a race, not a marathon, but it was a 5K race. It started in the Seaport District of Boston, and then it went through Mass General Hospital where I practice clinically. And so I said, okay, you know what? Parking is free at MGH. Why don't I go and park there and watch her on the marathon route? And so I was driving along this main thoroughfare to try to get to the hospital, but it was blocked off. And so I had to come back home. And then I saw her a couple hours later, and I mentioned this to her, and she said, gee, I wonder what happens to people who need to get to the hospital on the day of a marathon. So it turns out, if you take data from Medicare, we have data on essentially every person who is insured by Medicare. We know when they go to the hospital, which doctors they see, what happens to them in terms of healthcare outcomes. What you observe is that people who are in Medicare, who have a cardiac arrest, so again, cardiac arrest is not a condition that you, A, obviously want to have, and B, it's not one that you choose. You don't choose to have a cardiac arrest on Marathon Monday in Boston versus a surrounding day. It just happens. So it's random. So people in Medicare who have a cardiac arrest or a heart attack on the day of a major U.S. marathon have about a 15% increase in 30-day mortality once they get to the hospital. Versus if you look at the identical days of the week and the surrounding weeks, so if this is the orange line in this plot, the mortality rate is basically pretty flat. And if you look at the surrounding areas, so let's say you move outside of Boston, but you look at Worcester, where I think St. Vincent's Hospital is. If you look at Worcester, there's no effect of Marathon Monday, in this case Boston. So this is a study we published in the New England Journal of Medicine. It came out a couple of days actually before last year's Boston Marathon. And we looked at 10 different cities in the United States over about 10 or 11 years. And we had this pretty impressive finding that mortality goes up a lot. Now, my question to you all is, if you look at that chart and you see that mortality goes up for patients who have acute cardiac conditions on the day of a marathon, we just talked about one possibility, which is that there's roads that are blocked. What other possibilities might there be?
Higher stress from the runners.
Yeah, so maybe this is amongst runners. And by the way, feel free to just start coming up to the podium. You see how this game is going to unfold, and just throw out answers. So it could be maybe this is among runners. Now, how would you look at that possibility? See whether this is among runners.
I think we should ask microphone 1.
Oh, okay. So, state your name.
Ron Hublall, but I wasn't actually thinking about that. I wasn't thinking about runners. I was thinking about what about EMS being occupied?
Okay, so maybe EMS is occupied. So this is a mechanism. So EMS may be occupied because they are on the scene. And so maybe transport times for EMS trucks to get to patients' homes might be slower. So that's one mechanism. I'm going to show you some data on that in a second. You mentioned something about runners, right? So it turns out that because this is data from Medicare, you know the zip code where the person lives. So you can see, are these individuals who are visiting from out of town? So we can take out that possibility off the bat. These are not individuals who are visiting out of town. These are people who live on the marathon route itself. You can also then look at people who are, let's say, above the age of 70 who are on dialysis. Likely to be running marathons or not? Maybe the best of them, but most likely not. And you find the same finding among people who are unlikely to be running marathons themselves.
You could try to cross-reference to the marathon, who was running the marathon, if that data is available. So.
Exactly. So you could actually link data on marathon runners to whether or not they die. So that would be a very straightforward way. What you could also do is look at EMS data. So it turns out in these cities we were able to get data from EMS trucks to see how long it takes to get to people's homes and to get from the home to the hospital. And what you find is that there's an increase in transport time to get from someone's home to the hospital. It's about a 20 to 30% increase. Now, for the panel, when do you think this increase would occur? Would it be in the morning or the evening or both? When would it take longer for patients to get to the hospital? After or before? So raise your hand if you say in the morning it would take longer. And who says in the afternoon it would take longer? Okay, so it turns out in the morning it takes longer, and the reason it takes longer in the morning is because that's when the roads are closed. And in the afternoon or late evening, actually I should have probably not said afternoon, if I said late evening may have been a little bit easier. In the late evening, the roads reopen. So what you can see in this plot is on the top panel, what I've shown here is the increase in ambulance transport times on the mornings of marathons. They go up about 30% in areas that are directly affected, whereas in the surrounding areas, which is this dark blue line, there's no difference. If you look at the evening, there's basically no real pattern. It looks pretty flat. So that tells you that this is something about ambulance transport times. Now, what's the relevance of this issue? It's relevant in the following sense, that we have public events around us all the time. So for example, those of you who like Taylor Swift, if you go to a Taylor Swift concert, you're probably, Neil, did you go to the Taylor Swift concert? No?
Unfortunately, no.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, okay. So, you know, if you go to a Taylor Swift concert and you see police officers or emergency personnel, you might be thinking to yourself, wow, okay, these folks are here to help security and safety of the people who are actually in this event. But what we probably never thought about is what about all the people who live in the surrounding areas who might be affected by such a large event? And for example, in Boston, there are a lot of these events. Fenway Games, Patriots Games, July 4th celebration, these are all massive public events. And the idea here is not that we should not hold Boston Marathon or other marathons, but that we should start to think a little bit more about these other spillover effects that we hadn't considered. All right, so that's how we will do this. And I have about 5 examples to go through, and we'll go through them pretty quickly. I won't spend a lot of time on each one, but the idea here is to think on the spot, just come up with whatever ideas you can, and then we'll work through them. And I do appreciate all of you coming up to the podium, so please continue to do so. All right, who knows what the Joint Commission is? Raise your hand. Who loves the Joint Commission? Let me get this binocular out here. I saw one hand. It says Joint Commission on your badge. No, I'm just joking. All right, Joint Commission. That's all I'm going to tell you. Come up with some ideas.
I'm going to guess outcomes are probably worse when they're around.
Outcomes are worse. Clearly, Neil didn't work for the Joint Commission prior to being a radiologist. All right, so outcomes are, so what do you mean by worse when they're around? What do you mean exactly?
More like worse mortality with kind of the same metrics that we were looking at, or worse kind of hospital-associated infections, things along those lines.
Okay, all right, so I'm going to ask you all a question. Raise your hands, and then also in the audience. So imagine a Joint Commission visit at your hospital, pretty stressful, right? So I'm going to give you 3 options. Mortality goes up the week that a Joint Commission visit occurs, and they happen for 4 or 5 days. So mortality goes up, that's going to be the first choice, stays the same or goes down. So raise your hand if you agree with Neil. Mortality goes up the week of a Joint Commission visit. Raise your hands high. Oh, wow. You all don't think so highly of the Joint Commission. All right, raise your hand if mortality is the same when the Joint Commission comes. Okay, I will raise my hand. I would have thought it was the same. Raise your hand if mortality falls when the Joint Commission comes. Okay, 1, handful, okay. All right, so before I show you the next slide, you could have also said, well, you know, I wonder if the Joint Commission actually serves its intended purpose? Like, are organizations that are accredited any better than organizations that are not? It turns out there's some evidence on that question. And it seems like hospitals actually are pretty similar in terms of quality of care and patient satisfaction, whether they have Joint Commission accreditation versus, let's say, state accreditation. So it seems not to matter so much, at least on some aggregate outcomes like mortality, readmissions, and patient satisfaction. But here's a study of ours from JAMA Internal Medicine, which looked at data from about 3,000 or 4,000 hospitals and several thousand visits by the Joint Commission. So we were able to extract from the Joint Commission website the exact dates of a visit, of an initial accreditation visit. These visits happen every few years. They are supposed to be unannounced. The hospitals may have a sense of the overall several-month window that the Joint Commission might come and visit. And what do you see here? So time zero is the week of a visit. So let me ask you on this side here, what do you see when the Joint Commission comes? This is 30-day mortality of patients who are admitted to the hospital the week of a Joint Commission visit. And that midpoint line there is time zero, which is the week of the visit versus the surrounding 3 weeks. What do you observe?
So in the week of the visit, it goes down, but it goes back up and sometimes even higher than before, right after.
A couple weeks later.
Yeah.
And does the effect look like it's larger or smaller at major teaching hospitals versus non-major teaching hospitals? The major is the middle panel, non-major teaching hospitals, meaning these are not teaching hospitals, is the bottom panel.
Non-major is higher.
Major is a bigger effect. That's the middle panel. The labeling is a little bit off. So the larger reduction in mortality is observed in teaching hospitals. Now, why would it be the case that 30-day mortality of patients who are admitted to the hospital during the week of a Joint Commission visit would be lower? Why would mortality be lower? Let me start over here, and then I'll move over here, so you have time to think. Why would mortality be lower?
Everyone's on their best behavior when the Joint Commission is here. You've done drills before they get there, and everyone's doing what they're supposed to do.
So everyone's doing what they're supposed to do when the Joint Commission comes. So they're washing their hands, they're documenting properly, they're not drinking coffee, with the exception of Neil and I. We're not using Facebook. I'm just picking on you. You're not using Facebook while you're treating patients. So what other things would be consistent with that hypothesis? What else could you check that would support that? So you could look at, for example, let's say hospital-acquired infection rates. So you could look at this data and see whether or not rates of C. diff infection or catheter-associated UTIs or bloodstream infections, whether those fall during the week of a Joint Commission visit. Turns out that we don't observe any reductions in those things. We just see reductions in mortality. So why else might mortality fall?
I think people might realize they're making mistakes during that week.
Say it again?
They might realize they're making mistakes the week prior.
So they might realize they're making mistakes and they might correct them. There may be a heightened sense of awareness. What else?
I mean, we all work hard, but I would think there'd be some element of like the Hawthorne effect or something.
Do you know what the Hawthorne is? How would you describe that?
If I was correct in my non-interpretive skills definitions, and correct me if I'm wrong, I could have gotten the incorrect name, but Hawthorne effect, that when you're sort of being watched by somebody, you tend to work maybe harder or you're more in line. And not saying that we don't work hard for our patients every day, but we know that a very important body is coming in and that they're watching us, and that perhaps, kind of alludes to best behavior practices that inherently or subconsciously we may be working harder for our patients.
Yeah, exactly. So there's this idea called the Hawthorne effect. Oh, let me take a question, and I'm going to follow up on that from podium 2.
I just had an idea that since the effect was bigger at teaching hospitals, maybe the attendings hid the residents.
Or vice versa.
Or maybe, yeah.
I didn't talk about our study about how patient mortality increases as the age of the hospitalist increases. That's different. I kind of choose the demographics of the room before I start describing work. So it could be this Hawthorne effect. It's this idea that when you're being monitored, your behavior is different than when you're not being monitored. I mean, think about when you were in medical school or how your kids might behave when you're being watched. Not to liken what we do in the hospital to being kids who are being monitored, but when you're being watched, there may be a heightened level of awareness. Maybe you're focusing a little bit more than you might have otherwise, and maybe those small differences might have an effect on your clinical decision making. So 2 comments on the first point.
Are you simply deferring big cases during that week and making sure you're not doing anything too complicated?
Good. So it could be that could be a few things along that vein. So one is maybe you're not doing as complicated cases, be surgical or interventional in some form. Or maybe it's that the hospital is not taking outside hospital transfers because they don't want to take complicated patients. Now, it turns out that if you look at the data, the number of patients who are hospitalized is identical, down to the digit. It's identical. So that's not what's going on. Also, if you look at the distribution of complexity of patients, the types of surgeries that are performed, it's also the same. And when I ask hospital executives about this paper, they say, well, you know, the reason why is because we're a hospital. We can't just close down our doors to certain patients or not perform important or profitable procedures because we think that the Joint Commission might come, because there's a trade-off there. So it turns out that that's not what's going on.
What if they staff more nurses those weeks?
Excellent. So raise your hand if you think that they staff more nurses. So my guess is that it's probably a 2 things. So one is this Hawthorne effect, where people change their behavior when they're being monitored. 2 is that there may be changes in staffing. And those changes in staffing could be a few forms. One would be physician staffing, and the other would be non-physician staffing. So we can look at physician staffing because we have data from Medicare. So we can see every doctor who is billing during those days in those hospitals. And we see there's no difference in the number of doctors or even the composition of doctors who are billing Medicare during those days. So it's not about doctors. It may be about nurses. So if you had electronic health record data from these systems, you could see how many unique logins there were by non-physician staff. So that might actually be what is going on. Now, ultimately, we don't have the answer to this question, but what we know is that something as, you know, I don't want to say as simple, but something like an organization just coming and watching you has a mortality effect. So this is not like we're reducing healthcare costs or increasing healthcare costs by a little bit. What we're seeing is a reduction in mortality. So it's important to try to unpack what is it about clinical decision making that is changing during this period. Question over there.
Just curious if there's potentially more staffing that's not reflected in schedules, for instance, faculty spend more time supervising residents.
It could be. So we couldn't look at that, but one way that you might look at that is see when is the last keystroke entry for physician and non-physician providers. So there would be ways which if you had the data from these institutions, you could get a sense of whether or not faculty are working longer hours, or physicians are working longer hours, or non-physicians as well. One more, and then we'll move on to the next example.
Could you look at physician behavior by seeing whether they're signing reports quicker on those days and sort of look at the other metrics that hospitals measure?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you had EHR data, you could look and see how fast they're signing notes. Maybe they're quicker, maybe they're slower. You could look at, for example, admission notes or progress notes, look and see whether there's less cut and pasting activity, broader differential diagnoses that are being listed. So if you use natural language processing that's being used within your own field to analyze radiology reports and extract important information, that same type of methodology, those same type of tools could be used to look at notes of general medicine providers in the inpatient setting to get a sense of what might be different in the care that they're providing. All right, what is this?
It's a big medical conference.
A big medical conference. Which medical conference is it?
American College of Cardiology.
American College of Cardiology. Okay. I didn't pick on ACR.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I was told there's a few things that are off limits. No, I'm just kidding. All right. American College of Cardiology. What ideas come to mind? Or big cardiology meeting.
Guideline compliance rates after the meeting.
Guideline compliance rates after the meeting. What is your hypothesis?
Presumably they'll have more awareness of the guidelines, so compliance should go up.
Good. So maybe what you would say is, all right, let's look at data and see whether or not appropriate prescribing goes up before versus after the meeting. And you might then say, well, and let's look at people who are likely to attend the meeting. So if you had data on the actual attendees, you might look at their specific prescribing patterns or utilization patterns. Or you could look at places that are closer to the meeting that particular year and say, let's assume that the information diffuses a little bit closer to people around it who are more likely to have attended the meeting. Turns out if you look at that, we don't see a dramatic increase in kind of either appropriate prescribing or use of technologies that debuted at the meeting.
Maybe Twitter use.
Say again?
Twitter use. Twitter use.
Oh, Twitter use. Yeah, I'm sure that goes up. I see a lot of that, yeah. Absolutely. So what else? What other ideas about cardiology meetings?
Microphone 3.
Yes.
Mortality goes up throughout the country because all the cardiologists are busy at the meeting.
Oh, okay. All right. Mortality goes up across the country. All right. So let's take a couple comments, questions, and I'm going to follow up on that. So over here, 2.
So if the question is about this picture too, then I think of commercialism, selling. This is the exhibition hall. So there's that part of this too.
Beautiful. Good. So I'm just asking you to look at this photo and tell me what ideas come to mind. So I'm looking at this right near, and I see Rapatha. Where in the world did they come up with that name? How does that name even, it's not something you think about. So for example, does the marketing work? Now, there's a lot of studies that look at whether doctors who get marketed for certain products are more likely to prescribe them, and by and large, they find small effects. But it's very difficult to establish what's true causal effect there because doctors not being randomized to these sales strategies. But here, for instance, you could look at whether or not brand prescribing for cardiovascular medications goes up as a proportion of relative to generic prescribing in the weeks after these meetings. Turns out they don't go up. We've looked at that.
Mortality improves because there's no unnecessary procedures done by the cardiologists.
Oh, wow, okay. You all do realize that the American College of Cardiology is like 15 minutes away from here. I saw their building last night. All right, so raise your hand. 3 options. During the dates of major cardiac meetings, cardiology meetings, national meetings, mortality goes up, down, or stays the same. Who says mortality goes up? Raise your hand. So mortality for patients who have acute cardiovascular conditions who are hospitalized during the dates of the meetings, mortality goes up. All right, okay. Mortality stays the same. Okay, and then mortality goes down. Okay, all right. So it turns out that mortality falls. And it falls by a lot. So this is very puzzling. Because when I thought about this idea, I thought, oh, okay, if anything, mortality is going to go up because cardiologists, the premier cardiologists, the ones who are really grounded in clinical medicine, they're leaving their institutions and going to this convention. These conventions are really large. They attract more than 10,000 people, probably on that order of magnitude in terms of numbers of cardiologists nationally. And so it's plausible that with such a large supply shock and a change in the composition of cardiologists, you might observe something. But what we found was that if you pick a condition like cardiac arrest, where 70% of people who make it to the hospital, Medicare patients who make it to the hospital, 70% are dead within 30 days of that hospitalization. That number falls to 60% if you happen to be hospitalized with a cardiac arrest on the date of a major cardiology meeting. So to give you a sense of that magnitude effect is larger than all of the cardiovascular interventions that have been studied. I think really to date, if you think about the effect of aspirin or beta blockers or statins, those don't confer a 10 percentage point mortality reduction within 30 days. So it's something about the composition of care that's being provided that is so different on the dates of these meetings compared to the surrounding meetings. Now, why might that be? So why might it be the case that mortality falls so much?
So you could look at the demographics of who's going to the meeting and who's staying behind. So if either more senior people are at the meeting, junior people may be handling patients different or vice versa.
Good, so you could start to look at the composition. So maybe what's going on is that we see who are the doctors who are staying behind versus going, and we measure their mortality rates for their patients, and then see if what's happening is that the doctors who tend to have higher mortality rates are going away to the meeting. We've looked at that, and it turns out that might be going on. We also have linked data on who is billing Medicare during the dates of those meetings, these are cardiologists, versus not billing Medicare. The doctors who tend to be billing Medicare, not billing Medicare during the dates of those meetings, so who are kind of proxied for going to the meeting, they tend to publish a lot more papers, do a lot more research. So there could be this division between kind of clinical work and research work that would be relevant. But so that's one explanation. What else?
So to think differently, and I'm Colin Segovas, the authority gradient that would exist is disrupted. Maybe that has something to do with it.
Good, good. So Colin had an excellent idea. So maybe, particularly in major teaching hospitals, which is where we find this effect to be the largest, it could be that the freedom for junior physicians or even residents or fellows to kind of voice an opinion might be different. Might be that feeling, that desire to do so might be higher, and so you might have more open thinking and better patient outcomes. Great.
So there might be some overuse of procedures, so inappropriate use because the cardiologists are not intervening on every patient walking in. So kind of like inappropriate use of radiology, so that could be affecting the impact.
Wait. Did you just say inappropriate use of radiology?
No.
Okay, no.
Inappropriate.
Oh, okay.
The word inappropriate. Yes.
Inappropriate. I'm just playing with it. So I completely agree. So if you look at their data, what you see is that rates of stenting, coronary stenting, PCI, technical term, they fall by about 30% for heart attack patients during the dates of this meeting. So I want you to kind of think about these two patients who you for sure would have seen in some context. One is a 45-year-old guy. He's a construction worker, he smokes, no other medical problems. He's working on site, he has chest pain, he gets rushed to the ED, they do an EKG, and he has an ST elevation myocardial infarction. Very specific EKG finding. He goes to the catheterization lab, gets a stent. 2 days later, he's discharged from the hospital, does just fine. Imagine a 90-year-old woman who lives in a nursing home, has 10 different medical problems, is on 12 different medications. She has chest pain at the nursing home. She's brought to the ED, and she has the exact same EKG. So she gets rushed to the cath lab as well. She gets a stent, but she has a complication from that procedure, and she dies within 10 days of the procedure. So you can see how in one case, the appropriateness of the stent seems to be much higher than in the other case. It's not to say that the 90-year-old woman shouldn't have gotten the stent, but if you had to bet who would be more likely to benefit, you might have thought that the first person would. So the idea here is that if you asked a cardiologist to allocate 100 PCIs, and only 100 PCIs to the patients that they thought that they treated in a given year who would be most benefited by that PCI, they would probably do a pretty good job of allocating who are the patients who would be most appropriately treated, who would benefit the most. But in reality, there's no such constraint. We can perform 110 PCIs or 200 PCIs. And over time, we work ourselves into this place where it's no longer a black and white decision of benefit, but it maybe becomes gray. And I doubt that physicians are practicing in the part where it's black and white, where they know there's a harm. But that gray area, depending on how good we are at clinical decision making, might actually confer harm to patients. Two.
Alan Pliski, I'm just going to, I guess I'll start by acknowledging a potential conflict of interest that I represent nuclear medicine, where frequently a cardiologist who does echo but doesn't actually do nuclear medicine themselves will not do a nuclear study when they should appropriately. So, barring that, I'd just like to say my father, who recently died of congestive heart failure at a community hospital, went to the hospital, was seen by a hospitalist, and this is maybe anecdotal to the survey, but maybe not. They waited, because my father has a cardiologist in the community, they really didn't give him much therapy or want to alter any medication without consulting the cardiologist. The cardiologist showed up about 24 hours later. Mm-hmm. So nothing really happened in his care the first day of his hospitalization, and I think that I think that actually may be a systemic problem, but that was the problem in his case.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right, and this is an issue that doesn't just extend to cardiology. It's like, what do we do when a physician who's very familiar with their patient is no longer in the hospital or is not available? So we're actually doing some work looking at what happens when physicians, essentially when they go on vacation, when we observe a primary care doctor to no longer be in the Medicare data for a few weeks, where we assume they're on vacation. We're looking to see what happens to their patients. Are they more likely to be hospitalized for ambulatory sensitive conditions? So it speaks to the importance of patient-specific information by a provider. So let's take 2 more comments, 4 and then 3.
So if the effect is primarily in cardiac arrest or the heart failure patients, what is specifically different about how or who is caring for those patients as opposed to acute myocardial infarction patients?
So the question is what is different about patients who have high-risk heart failure or cardiac arrest versus AMI? So what you see here is that the effect is really driven by high-risk heart failure and AMI. And cardiac arrest. And I was speaking about PCI rates. Now, the limitations of these data are that we can't tell you, I can't tell you what exactly is being done in the hospital that is different. On some large things like PCI, I can tell you that. But beyond that, in terms of clinical decision making, I can't tell you what's different. I can tell you something about the characteristics of physicians who tend to be treating patients during this time versus not. But otherwise, this is kind of a black hole, which I think is unique in the sense that it can tell us something about where we should be looking for things that can have large impacts on mortality as far as it relates to how physicians make decisions. One more.
Paul Count from South Carolina. We listened to a fantastic multimedia presentation from our all-star economics panel yesterday about value-based care versus fee-for-service. And this is a perfect example because cardiology does self-refer. Radiology is completely above board and lily white, because every dollar we make, somebody else, signs an order for. It's a little bit of exaggeration, but it's pretty true. And I just think this is a perfect example of where many other specialties have a lot bigger moral issue and ethical issue and medical issue with doing the right thing. And that's a perfect example you gave between the 40-year-old and the 90-year-old, should they be stented or not. And when you're stenting for dollars, that's what happens.
Yeah. So let me respond to that in a second. Let me get this one comment here, and I can see if I can tie them up in 2.
A bit of a question. I'm Emil Lee from the Canadian Association of Radiologists. If this were a clinical trial, and you were running it, and you had a survival rate that doubled, 30% to 60%, you might actually stop the trial at that point and say, I'm sorry, this is unfair to all the other patients in the other limb. Mm-hmm. So my question is, in essence, who cares why? Is the effect sustained? So is there any data to show that keeping those physicians away, and I don't really mean that in that way, but keeping those physicians away from those hospitals actually maintains that rate of survival, or does it fall down?
So I don't know that question, and in order for this to change policy, cardiologists actually have to believe what I'm saying. So that's the first obstacle. But I think this is a big black box because there's something that's clearly different here, but I can't tell you what it is that's different. I mean, I can give you certain signals, so I can say that on some measures of intensity of care, it seems to be going down. But I don't think it's that simple. I think there's differences in clinical decision making. It could be the authority issue that was just brought up earlier. But ultimately, it's coming down to differences in clinical decision making, which is a huge black box. We know there's a lot of variation in what physicians do, but we don't know what drives it, and then we also don't know what the implication of that is for patient outcomes. So to this point about whether the financial incentives explain some of this, I think it could. But I think that what's a bigger driver is not how these physicians are getting paid. I think that these physicians are doing what they think is clinically appropriate. And the reason why I say that is that if you look across the country, you will find that for similarly complex patients, the level of variation in spending and utilization of care is like 30% or higher. And this is among doctors who are facing the same financial incentives. So that tells you that there is something that's really important about clinical variation across physicians that is not due to how doctors are being paid, but due to how doctors think differently. And I bet if I were to ask you to interpret an image here, or a question like that, there'd be tremendous variation, and we'd be doing it for free. So there's something about how we train doctors that leads to this variation in practice style. All right, a couple more examples. What is this? I think the banner almost speaks for itself. But so what ideas come to mind? No one wants to speak up on this one?
Whether gun deaths increase or decrease around the time of the NRA convention.
Okay, you had to go there, huh? No. So what is the idea? What are you thinking?
I don't want to say anything further than what I just said.
I have no further comment. All right, any ideas?
Also, how does gun use affect health outcomes?
Good, yeah. So look at this photo right here. This is a photo of the 2016 NRA annual convention. These conventions are large. They attract about 80,000 people a year, maybe more. They have spillover effects that extend beyond just attracting a lot of potentially high utilizing gun owners. Venues might be closed where guns might be used, whether it be a shooting range, or I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, so I'm aware of anecdotes of farms that people would open up their own farms to be used for hunting if you have a large home, a large area. And that might be more likely to be closed during the dates of these conventions. So it's possible that you could see reductions in injuries due to firearms during this period, because there's this large absorption effect where a lot of people who use firearms attend this convention, and venues where firearms might be used would be closed. So let me now ask an audience poll and all of you to weigh in. If you looked at data from a large insurance company or set of large insurance companies, and you looked at rates of gun injuries during the specific dates of these meetings compared to identical dates in the surrounding weeks, do you think that you'd find an increase, decrease, or no change in gun injuries? So who says an increase in gun injuries during the dates of the meetings? Okay, who says no change? Okay, I would have said no change. I'll always raise my hand, no change. And a reduction. Okay, so I'd say maybe 2/3 of you say reduction. So what you observe actually is that there's a large reduction. Now this is a little bit noisy, but what you observe is there's a pretty large reduction in gun injury during the dates of these meetings. Now, this is not a very simple finding for the following reason. About 1 to 2% of gun owners probably go to these meetings. So the NRA, in terms of its membership size compared to all gun owners in the United States, is actually relatively small. And then on top of that, we're talking about a subsample of NRA members who might go to the meeting. And so if it's the case that only 1 to 2% of gun owners go to a convention, how could it be that we observe a 15% reduction in gun injuries? So first of all, the finding could be wrong. I'll completely acknowledge that. Second of all, you have to think about the statistics here. I'm saying 15%, but you can see that the error bars are quite large. So I can't say that it's not 5%. I can say that it's not 0, but I can't say with any degree of certainty whether it's a 5% reduction or 15% reduction, but nonetheless it appears to be a reduction. And the other thing to remember is that the people who are more likely to attend these conventions are more likely to be heavier users. So the typical gun owner in America probably keeps their gun in a locked cabinet and may not even know where the key is. But that's not really relevant here, because what you want to know is what proportion of gun injuries occur among a select group of highly skewed users who are more likely to use firearms. And so what we observe here is this large reduction. And the point here is not to say that we should have NRA conventions every week of the year. That's not the point. But it is to say something about the safety of firearm use. There is a view, which I think experienced gun owners would say doesn't make any sense, but there is a view that guns in the hands of experienced users are completely safe. And I think talking to users of firearms who are experienced, they say that's absolutely not true. Just like driving a car. If you drive a car, that is inherently more unsafe than walking around in circles in your apartment. No matter how experienced you are, there's always some positive risk of injury, and that's what we find here. Now, what would be a prediction if you're willing to believe this hypothesis that some of this effect is being drawn by people who are heavy users of firearms going to the convention? What would be a prediction of that theory in terms of where we might observe larger reductions in gun injuries during the dates of conventions? Any ideas? So suppose a convention is held one year in San Diego, California, and you've got people who live in New Hampshire versus people who live in Northern California. Where do you think the reductions in injuries would be larger during the period?
Locally would be, you have a larger impact in the same state as the convention.
Exactly, yeah. So what we find is that when the convention is held in a given person's state in a given year, the reduction in injuries is larger. And that makes sense because it's easier to go to the actual convention than it would be otherwise. You have a question? Oh, that was the statement, okay. So, it could be that this is about an absorption effect, if you will. You also find larger reductions in states or areas with higher rates of gun ownership. Also, mostly among males, 80% of the convention attendees approximately are males. So there's a few things that kind of line up with this idea that this is about an absorption effect of people who will be high users of firearms or about venues being closed. All right, 3 more examples. We'll go through these faster. Any of you have kids? So raise your hand if you have kids. Okay, 1, and okay. Do you know what a school entry age cutoff is?
So have to turn 5 by around September 1st, plus or minus a couple weeks.
Good, okay. So you have to be a certain age by September 1st in order to enter kindergarten in many states. Other states have different cutoffs, but let's say September 1st is the cutoff. You have to be a certain age by September 1st. If you're not, then you enter the next year. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So what does it have to do with ADHD?
If you look at birth dates and the rates of ADHD diagnoses in kids that just made the cutoff, so they presumably are more immature, so compared to their older classmates that may had to defer a year. So look at rates of ADHD diagnoses.
Good, so now imagine you have 2 kids in the class, Timmy and Tommy. Timmy was born August 25th. Tommy was born September 5th. So Tommy is about a year older than Timmy in this class because of this arbitrary school age cutoff. Now, a teacher sees both of these kids' behavior, and then Timmy, who's the younger side for his class, Timmy is behaving a little bit inattentively, and the teacher looks at him and thinks, well, maybe something's off. Maybe he should be more attentive than he is. And a conversation occurs with a parent or a counselor, which ultimately works its way up to a pediatrician, maybe a child psychiatrist. And then it turns out that Timmy, who was born in August, is about 30 to 40% more likely to be not only diagnosed, but medically treated for ADHD than Tommy, who was born in September. Now, I started at the very beginning of this talk talking about these arbitrary thresholds which induce randomization. That's exactly what's happening here. We have a September 1st cutoff in about 18 states. Kids who are just below the cutoff are among the younger kids in their class, and kids who are just above the cutoff randomly are amongst the older kids in their class. And teachers and parents would seem to perceive differences in behavior as reflecting some degree of underlying pathology, as opposed to kids being different in maturity, which would be expected by almost a year. So this is a huge effect, and this is data from the last couple of years. So even though there's increased awareness about potential overdiagnosis of ADHD, we see that there's 30 to 40% higher rates of ADHD among these kids who were born in August versus September. Now, what would this plot look like? This is for you all. What would this plot look like if we looked at states without a September 1st cutoff? Should you observe the same thing?
Probably not.
Probably not. So you could do it for each individual cutoff in a given state, but what I've shown here is in states without a September 1st cutoff, that's on the right side of the screen, you see no August versus September effect. It really only emerges in states with this September 1st cutoff. Now, where would you expect to see larger differences, boys or girls? Boys. So you see larger differences in boys, but the difference is still there in girls. So even girls who are born in August are still more likely than girls who are born in September to be diagnosed with ADHD. And these aren't small effects. This is a large degree of additional diagnosis. And so I started by saying overdiagnosis. I mean, to be fair, we can't really say that this is overdiagnosis without knowing whether or not this was an appropriate or inappropriate decision. But if I had to bet, I would bet on overdiagnosis because this is a condition where people think that kids are being overdiagnosed. But likely what's happening is that there's some degree of over and underdiagnosis that is occurring. All right, couple more. What is this?
Movie.
A movie.
It's a movie. What movie?
Fast and Furious.
The Fast and Furious. Who's seen this movie, or any of the 18 movies that have been released? No. Okay, all right. The Fast and the Furious. All right, what ideas come to mind?
Injury from car accidents. I mean, the main actor, Paul Walker, died in a car accident because he was driving haphazardly.
Good. So maybe injuries go up after the movie, right? And Paul Walker died, unfortunately, from driving fast. So there's a lot of literature about how the media affects behavior. We just had a piece a couple of days ago that showed that visits for suicidal ideation go up almost immediately after the Netflix show 13 Reasons Why, which may reflect a positive effect of the show, but it also may reflect something unwanted, which is an increase in kind of suicidal thinking. But studies like that are hard to do because you can't just compare people who watch, let's say, violent movies. I don't know if I'd call this violence per se, but movies like this versus watch, The Great Baking Show or the English Baking Show. Does anybody know that show? Yeah, everybody does, yeah. So people who watch that are different than people who watch Fast and Furious. So if you were to observe that people who watch the baking show drive slower than people who watch Fast and Furious, that wouldn't tell you anything about the causal effect of watching the Fast and the Furious. But as you kind of pointed out, what you can do is, if you have data on actual driving patterns before and after this movie release, what you can see is the following. You can see that on the weekends after the movie is released, which is where that dark red line is, that the average speed at which people are caught speeding above the speed limit increases. It increases by about 15% kind of the weekends after Fast and Furious movie releases. Now, suppose I say to you, well, maybe this is not about the Fast and Furious per se, but this is about just big blockbuster movies. Maybe that's what's driving this effect. How would you exonerate that possibility? How would you exonerate the possibility that this is not due to just a big blockbuster movie effect?
Compare against Star Wars or Harry Potter.
Exactly, Star Wars or Harry Potter or Hunger Games. Though you might find like bow and arrow accents go up after Hunger Games, I guess. So you would look and you actually don't see anything. So if you look at Hunger Game movies, that's what we've looked at. The pattern looks flat. These movies also come out every couple of years. So let's say the movie came out in 2013, 15, and 17. We could take those exact release dates from 2013, 15, and 17, and then shift them back 1 year to 2012, 14, and 16, and replicate the same plot. And what would we see? It wouldn't look like this. It would look very flat. So it's not about the time of year when these movies are released. Turns out that the state where we got this information from is actually very close. In Maryland, actually has the GPS coordinates of where individuals are ticketed. And it's hard to see in this map, but what you can see actually is that the tickets seem to occur very close to this thoroughfare where the various movie theaters lie. But if you look at the preceding weeks, there's no such geographic concentration. So in the preceding weeks, tickets are getting handed out for speeding all over the place. But in the weekends after the movie release, they seem to happen along this same thoroughfare. So this kind of data, we're using it, we can look at a lot of different things. So for instance, we have the name, this is publicly available data, by the way. So we have the name of the person who's pulled over. We have the name of the police officer that pulls them over. So what if I were to tell you that the probability that you get a ticket is lower if you share the same name as the first officer that pulls you over? So if you take the same driver pulled over 2 different times, in one instance by the officer who has the same first name and in another instance by an officer who does not share the same first name, the likelihood of you getting a ticket is actually lower if you share the same first name, which is a problem for me if you know my first name. You, congratulations, you will be pretty good, actually. But also, it's widely recognized that there are large racial differences in policing, and the effect of having the same name as an officer, the benefit to a person is the same as being white versus black. So it tells you something about the importance of these kinds of phenomenon in terms of influencing how decision-making occurs. And you can imagine clinical context where something like this might occur as well. If you're interpreting a study and you notice, this person has the same first birthday, or they have the same uncommon last name like Rich. Maybe you think differently, and you could look at patterns for that kind of thing. Not to say that this is the solution to our healthcare crisis, but this tells us a little bit about how people think. Over there in question 5, yes.
I was just going to ask, what about police being hyper aware that the movie's been released that weekend?
Good, excellent. So what you might expect is that police anticipate this phenomenon. So they increase their policing during that period, or they may even go near the movie theaters like I just showed you and be more vigilant in those areas. Now what you would predict in that case is that the number of tickets would go up, but you wouldn't necessarily predict that the speeding above the speed limit, that average speed difference, would go up. So this is probably a combination of both, that policing may change, and in fact there's stories about how policing changes after these movies are released, but there's some degree of also individual drivers changing their behavior. All right, last one, and then I'll conclude. Do women promote themselves less than men? So we have done some work. I already described some of it earlier about how men and women different in how they practice medicine. We've also used data from a company called Doximity, which is like the LinkedIn of physicians, to look at gender differences in promotion and salaries. And we find that there's large differences, even if you account for what, in at least academic medicine, is a well-known currency, how many publications you have, what honors you've received, how many years of experience you have, where you trained, like all the things that you think might affect promotion. One question that always comes up is whether or not some of this difference is due to just differences in how men and women promote themselves to others, or self-promote themselves to others. Now this is a different question to study because you can ask surveys, people of surveys, that maybe doesn't tell you a lot. But are there other data-driven ways to do this? So I'm going to ask you all now to think about using PubMed. Have you all used PubMed? Everybody's used PubMed, right? Now, I want you to imagine searching for two names. One is Tina Jones, and one is Tommy Jones. Okay? You put in both of these names side by side. You look at all the abstracts that these two people have written, and you look at the first abstract from each. Now, imagine that abstract in your mind from Tina and Tommy. How might that information that you're seeing now on this screen be used to look at this question? Do men and women promote themselves differently? So imagine this abstract that you're visualizing on PubMed between a male author and a female author. Let's say it's a very similar study, same type of journal.
You could look at rates of self-citation.
Good, so you could look at rates of self-citation. So that might be reflective of kind of like saying, I've done a lot of work in this area and I'm citing myself more. Good, that's one idea. What else?
Authorship order.
Good, so maybe the differences come up in kind of the intra-author bargaining in terms of author order. Any other ideas?
How many authors are on each paper?
How many authors? So people have thought about whether there's more, I know papers in radiology have looked at how much collaboration there is. Are men or women more likely to collaborate? Now think about the text of the abstract.
The degree of confidence in the conclusions.
So can you give me an example?
The terminology used to say that this is, how would you say it? That this proves it, or this is, versus this suggests.
Yeah, exactly. So these are two articles that are pretty similar in the sense that I have no idea what either of them mean. Stepwise surface encoding for high throughput assembly of nanoclusters. I don't remember that in medical school. And this word mesenchymal, I remember something about that. But these are articles by a team in which the first and last author were male and the first and last author were female. And you can see that there are differences in the types of words that are used. For example, self-assembly offers a promising method, unique, remarkable, novel, assuring. This is the type of language that is used within the same journal, Nature Materials, on a topic category that is the same. But the male team uses different language. So if you look at several million abstracts, 5 million abstracts from PubMed, what you will see is that articles within the same journal that have been cited the same amount of times, that are in the same topic area, that have been published in the same year, articles in which a male first author and a male last author on that team are about 10% more likely to use terms like novel, unique, groundbreaking, promising, etc. So that tells you something about how language choice may matter. And it turns also that using those terms raises your downstream citations by about 10%. So it's not that this is just people viewing their work as being different, but it also may have an effect as well. And so in terms of applications to radiology, I'll just say this and then I'll close. So there's a lot of ways in which these natural experiments might be used to study questions that would be of interest to radiology. Some of these has already been explored to some extent. So what are the short and long-term implications of differences in how radiologists interpret findings? So for example, if you have a radiologist who's more likely to recommend follow-up imaging or uses terms that are a little bit more couching in nature, do we observe that healthcare spending in the weeks to months and how patient outcomes are different between radiologists who are presumably being quasi-randomized to these different types of studies? Or what is the effect of imaging on downstream incidental findings? So there's been a lot of concern about this recently. We're looking at patients who go into the ED, who are seen by physicians, ED physicians, who differ in terms of how their propensity to order imaging. And so a patient might be seen by a doctor who is 30% more likely to order a CT scan for a patient who's coming with shortness of breath. Now, do we then see that pulmonary nodules are identified at higher rates downstream? Does that have any effect on healthcare spending, patient outcomes? It very well might in directions that we wouldn't necessarily anticipate. And this is a way to use a natural experiment, which is this randomization of patients to different ED doctors who vary in their propensity to order imaging to try to understand something about the value of imaging. You might also look at how people's reports change when there's kind of events that are pertinent to them or to their colleagues. For example, a malpractice suit. So if you're in an institution where there's a big malpractice suit, do we see changes in the types of reports that are authored, or the language, or the length? So this is a way that you might try to apply some of this thinking to radiology. So I'll close in the last, I have 20 seconds, but allow me a minute and 20 seconds. So first of all, can we give a round of applause to our panel? They did it. So you all had no idea what you were going to do up here, and you came up here and you said some terrific ideas, and I realize it was stressful to put you in an awkward position, and I appreciate it. So I want you to take away a couple things. One is that all of this way of thinking is innate in all of you because of the way that you think, and ordinarily the patients you see, the clinical experiences that you have. So you all can do what I do, and I'm glad that you don't, because that would be hard for me. But I also recognize that you came up here and you put yourself outside of your comfort zone, and I appreciate that. And I'm going to repay the gesture in a way that is a little bit different, and I hope you'll bear with me, okay? So what I signed you was the following, is that 9 months ago, our son, whose name is Aiden, was born profoundly deaf in both ears. My wife, who I mentioned is a radiologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital, has been a rock. It was her who forced us to learn and immediately incorporate sign language into our life. And I signed that to you today for two reasons. One is because my hope, our hope, is that one day he will sit in the same seats that you sit in today. That's our hope as parents, to invest him in that way. The second is to always be open-minded. There's a lot of difficulties that we will all face, and think broadly, think differently, be open-minded. And the last thing is, as I said, it's really difficult for you all to come up here and put yourself in this position, and I appreciate it. So, thank you.